Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be learning the basics of the programming language Dart as fast as humanly possible. Now you might say, Jeffrey, why on earth are we learning a programming language called Dart? All we care about is Flutter. Well, I got some news for you, big important news. Dart is the language that underlies all of Flutter. So in order for you to program effectively in Flutter, you have to have a really solid foundation with Dart. And so by learning these really basic principles, you're going to be able to accelerate your Flutter programming to levels that you probably would not expect. So you might be asking yourself, why did Google and the Flutter team choose to use Dart as their underlying programming language instead of something like JavaScript, PHP, C, whatever? Well, there's a few reasons that are actually quite important. The first being, Dart is a very easy to learn and understand programming language. It's set up well, it makes sense, it's easy to read, and it uses core programming principles that you probably already know, especially if you've used a language in the past, such as Java, C, or even JavaScript itself. So now we're going to share a few important facts about Dart. Dart is an optionally typed programming language. What does that mean, you might be asking? In an optionally typed programming language, you have the ability to set any variable you want to a certain type. So for instance, if you had a variable called x, you could set that to an integer, and nobody throughout the rest of that program could change the type of that variable. It makes it easier to understand and write clean quality code, but it also adds an enhanced layer of security. But you might be saying this language is optionally typed. Well, there are certain scenarios where you might want to create a variable and leave it without a type. And Dart allows this, although the practice is not commonly encouraged. While we are talking about data types, we're going to go through the common data types that Dart provides. This list is actually very simple, but it gives you all the core functionality you need. Dart includes the following. Integers, which as you probably already know is a number without a decimal point, a whole number. Integers are very useful and you probably want to use them if you don't need a decimal point because it allows faster performance. The second data type is a double. A double is a precision floating point number that can have a decimal point and as many numbers as you need. They are very accurate, but it does include a slight performance penalty. So you would use these for things like currencies or uneven numbers. The next data type is a string. For those of you who have already taken computer science classes, you probably know a string is literally just a sequence of characters. Now don't let the term sequence of characters fool you. These sequences can be extremely long. So the word no would be a string, but you could also have a string that is an entire novel. So the strings are the primary data type when working with non-numeric characters or numeric characters that you're not doing mathematical computations on. The next data type is called a Boolean. Now a Boolean in computer science lingo simply means true or false. So if you need to define whether something is true or false and then act upon that data, you would use a Boolean data type. Now is where things start to get a little more exciting and give you more power and flexibility. The next data type is a list. Now, if you've programmed at all in the past, you've probably heard the term array. A list in Dart is equivalent to an array in a programming language like C, PHP, and many others. And what a list is simply an ordered list of data. The data can be an integer, it can be a double, a string, a Boolean, or any other kind of data that you might need to store in an ordered list. Moving on from the lists, we arrive at maps. A map is a key-value pair, which means you have a key, which could be a string like ID, and then you have a value, which could be an integer like 1. Or the key could be a string that says name, and a value, which is a string that says the name of a person, such as Jeffrey Booth. Now, if you've programmed before, you might be familiar with maps under the term dictionary. They're basically synonymous with each other. Between lists and maps, you can represent almost any type of data structure that you're going to need in the Dart programming language. The final data type that we're going to look at is the dynamic data type. Now that merely means that a variable assigned to the dynamic data type can be any kind of variable. It can include integers, doubles, strings, booleans, or objects that you create in the future. Now it's really easy to define a dynamic data type variable. You simply use the keyword var, V-A-R, before your variable. So to define a dynamic data type, we're merely going to use the var keyword, like so. We're going to type out var, and then we're going to define our variable name, which in this case is going to be is this dynamic. Now if you notice, we don't have to assign a value to this variable right away because this variable can change. So take a look at this. We have this variable called isThisDynamic. We can assign this to an integer, like so. We can assign this to a floating point by typing out 1.12. We can assign this to a string, which says Jeffrey is cool. And all of these will be valid implementations of this variable because we're using the dynamic data type. So you define a variable as an integer in the following way. Merely use the keyword int, define your variable name. We're going to call this isInteger, and then assign it a value. If you wish to define a double, you're going to do so like follows. Use the keyword double, type out your variable, which in this case is going to be isDouble, and then assign it a value, in this case 1.2. If you wish to define a string, you're going to use the keyword string. Now please note that when you're defining a string, you do need to capitalize the S, as Dart is case sensitive. So we're going to define a variable string, and we're going to call it isString. We'll assign this string a value of Jeffrey is the man. Don't forget your semicolons at the end. Bool values are defined by using the keyword bool. That's a lowercase b o-o-l. So we're going to call this variable isBool, and we're going to assign it a value of true because it is a bool. To define a list, you're going to use the keyword list, and like string, the L needs to be capitalized. So we'll type out list. We're going to call this variable isList. We're going to hit the equal sign, and then if you'll notice, to define a list, you can't just start typing out data. You actually have to use brackets. So anything inside of these brackets will be part of the list. So in this case, we're going to use a list of integers. We're going to type out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that is a list of integers. Now one small note, in Dart, if you would like to be more specific with the type of list and prevent people from entering data that you don't want entered, you can actually define a type for a list. So to define a data type for a list, we're actually just going to put the keyword int here. Now it doesn't have to be int. You could use bool, double, or any other type of data you want to be in the list. If you just enter list itself, somebody could enter different types of data in that list, which may be the functionality you desire, it may not be. That's going to be for you to decide as you architect your application. We are going to define a variable, isMap, and we're going to use the data type map, again with a capital M. To create a map, you need to use curly braces, and inside those curly braces, you're going to need to make the key value pair. So again, the key might be ID, which is a string, and an integer, which it would be 2 in this case. As with lists, we can define data types to the content found within a map. So you can define the data types for this map as follows. Start with a string and then assign the second value to be an integer. As with most modern programming languages, Dart supports the object-oriented paradigm, and it supports classes with single inheritance. But if you need to add extended functionality, you can use the built-in support for mix-ins that Dart offers. Now here is one of the most exciting things, and I think one of the main reasons Google actually chose Dart to support the Flutter framework. It is the hot reload functionality. You can actually make changes to your code and test them without recompiling applications. This greatly enhances the speed of your development efforts. Now here's one thing to keep in mind, and we've already touched on this, but Dart is a case-sensitive programming language. So if you find yourself not matching case on variable names, or function names, object names, class names, you're going to have an application that doesn't work, so always keep this in mind. Now last, but certainly not least, Dart requires that you end every statement with a semicolon. Now the paradigm of using semicolons at the end of each statement is going to make this language really comfortable for those of you who have been using legacy programming languages most of your career. And for those of you who are just starting, it's going to make it easier to read your code. I know a lot of people like how Python doesn't require you to use semicolons at the end of statements and rather relies on the formatting, but this, trust me, is easier to understand and read in the long run. Dart programs can be compiled and executed on x64 systems, ARM systems, but it can also be encoded into optimized JavaScript, so wherever you really need to deploy and use Dart, you can. Now that you know about Dart, let's jump into some code. Now, as you probably know, it's very, very customary for the first thing you do in a new programming language is to create an application that says, "Hello, world." So how do we do this in Dart? Well, there's a few things you need to know. The first is that inside of a Dart application, there's going to be a function called main. Now, you're going to notice this displayed like so. Now there's a few things you're going to notice here. This function is called the void type. All a void type means is that this function is not returning any data back. So if you ever have a function that just executes data, but it doesn't need to return data, use void on your function. So in Dart, doing the hello world application is super easy because Dart provides a function called print. So all you do is type print hello world, and we're going to use an exclamation point. Don't forget your semicolon at the end. So we have an application that says hello world. How do we run it? So to execute this application, all we're going to do is type Dart, and then we're going to type the name of the file that we stored our application in this case, hello world.dart. And you can see on the command line, hello world. Yes, our mission is accomplished. So now we're going to move on to a more complex application because hello world, while fun and motivating, is totally and utterly useless. Before we start writing our first real application, there's something you need to know, and that is how to write comments. Now, if you were a novice programmer, there are a lot of people who are going to say you shouldn't really comment your code because your code should be readable enough that you don't need to leave comments. However, I do not subscribe to this notion. I think you should leave comments if there's any concern at all that you might not be able to understand your code at a later date. Or worse, if you think a coworker or contributor to your project might not be able to understand your code. So to add a single line comment in Dart, you're going to use 2 forward slashes before the expression. So in this case, we're going to do 2 forward slashes and then we're going to type out comment. That's a single line comment. Now, if you want to leave something more robust, something with more information, you're probably going to want to use a multi-line comment, which is done as follows. You're going to do forward slash star, then you're going to type out multi-line comment, and then you're going to close the comment out with a star and a backslash. Now that you have a basic understanding of Dart and you've built your Hello World application, it's time to dig deeper. Join me in the next video where we are going to build our first real-world Dart application.